Emma, welcome.
Thank you.
I would like to start our conversation talking about board of directors. We know from some surveys that a majority of corporate boards do not actually discuss yet climate change, do not really engage with this whole idea of how am I going to translate climate change into business models, into the company's operations. So what do you think is the right approach for boards? What are the right questions on climate change that boards should be asking in order to engage, really engage with this issue?
Well, I find it surprising, particularly given the report that was published last October by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that boards are still not discussing this issue. This is several years after the Paris Agreement, which set a trajectory for meeting lower carbon targets. And at a time where we're seeing this agenda rise up, the things that investors are now discussing. And I think for every company, they need to approach it in the way that is relevant to their business, but really understanding how their business functions, not just in the local community, the country it's operating in, the world it's operating in, through its what it is doing, but through its supply chain. So it's very difficult to come up with one specific question, but I think any board member needs to be asking how best to address climate change as an issue and an opportunity for a business.
Right. So you personally have experience not only now in government, but also an entire career in the financial services sector. So picking up on that, what is it that perhaps the government or perhaps the financial sector or a combination thereof can do to sort of enable these board members to ask the right questions for their particular context? We know there are attempts at materiality of ESG issues, for instance, across industries and so on.
Well, I think one of the initiatives that has really gained momentum over the last year or so is the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure. Interestingly, this came back from powers that were given to the Environment Secretary in the Climate Change Act, which gave him the powers, or her the powers, to ask different bodies how they were approaching and responding to the issue of climate change. When the Governor of the Bank of England received a request to report around this, it led him to think about responses for the financial sector and ultimately to this task force. But it's still what the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure is doing is talking about disclosure. What we are so needing to take place is a movement from disclosure to action. And again, there are just many, many ways that individual companies can respond. As the Environment Agency, we are responsible for environmental regulation in England. We also have responsibility for flood and coastal risk management. And one of the things that we are very keen that businesses understand is their responsibility to think about the physical risks of climate change and whether their businesses should be looking at how they are best protected from whether it's flooding or drought, heat waves, etc. So I think one of the challenges we face is this is so multifaceted. We have to develop a very simple language and set of metrics so that we can really understand the action that is required.
So the language of risk is particularly important, I think, because that may actually propel companies to do what you mentioned, move from the transparency, disclosure sort of argument to actual action. And I would assume that in some circumstances, dealing with those risks is about investments, right? Investments in the transition, investment into adaptation, perhaps, to climate change. So when you think about, let's say, the overall level of investment that you observe as an environment agency, are we making progress? Do you see companies making those investments?
Well, investment takes place in many, many different forms. If we're thinking about investment in infrastructure, and if I look at the current spending review for this spending period for this government, our budget on flood-related infrastructure is a relatively small fraction of the overall strands of spending in infrastructure, whether it is public or privately financed. For all of that infrastructure, we need to be thinking not in separate buckets about is it relevant for the low carbon economy, we also need to be thinking about resilience. And we need to be integrating our thinking as to how to make sure that any investment we're making is fit for the future, both from the low carbon world we're hoping to get to, but also resilient to those physical risks, flooding, heat waves, things I've already talked about that are coming our way, so that those investments don't become stranded in the future.
It's interesting because I would assume that for that integration to happen, right, for decision makers to see these issues as essentially two sides of the same coin, right? You cannot make infrastructure investments without accounting with this, for these issues. It requires a mind frame change. I mean, it requires a lot of change in the way we look at these investments, in the way we think about these investments, and perhaps it requires a change in the time scale that we think about these investments, right? We often associate things like environmental issues and climate change as long-term, although obviously the effects are already in the short term. So in your experience, what are some of the reasons that may accelerate the change of those mind frames, but also what are some of the impediments?
I think one of the issues has been about timeframes. A lot of people are still thinking that climate change is something that is happening in the future, as opposed to happening now. I think that the language around fiduciary duty hasn't necessarily helped. I am the chair of the investment committee for the Environment Agency's pension fund, and we have been looking at our portfolio through an environmental sustainability lens and a climate change lens for over 10 years. We're delivering strong performance, as well as it being a fully funded pension fund. So I feel very strongly that as a trustee of a pension fund, I'm able to say that the performance we have brought to the pension fund is because we're looking through this long-term lens and environmental sustainability lens. And indeed, I would be in breach of my fiduciary duty if I wasn't taking these things into account. So those are just two of the areas. I was part of the UK government's Green Finance Task Force, and the UK government is due to publish a green finance strategy later this year. I think one of the things that came through that piece of work, facing both into the business department and into the treasury, was the complexity of the financial system. And you need so many parts of the system to change to fundamentally make sure that people are looking at climate change as an investment issue.
There's a perception out there, right, that there's a lot of stick. In other words, we're pushing companies to go towards lower carbon, to become more responsible and so on. And that's all good and fine because we need to, right? We're running out of time. But there's this other school of thought that would say, look, in the past, companies, especially large companies, iconic companies, have failed. Polaroid never became digital and it had to shut down, for instance. So much smaller changes have caused essentially corporate deaths. A transition to low carbon economy, it's a much bigger challenge, right? And there's those who say that if we only push instead of pull, in other words, if we go with regulation, taxes, and so on, which is what I would call institutions of push, then we're going to get a lot of failure along the way, and we cannot afford to because we're running out of time. We sort of need these companies to implement change to avoid catastrophic climate change. So the question there is, in addition to the stick, in other words, in addition to the taxes and the regulations and so on, what's missing in terms of institutions of pull? In other words, institutions that help enable companies to transition without a threat, but more about help in change management.
I do think the balance has to be got right.
Yeah.
I think we want to be working with the responsible end of the industry to encourage that change. I think there's things that we can be doing through procurement. There are some wonderful initiatives that are about the business community going 100% towards renewable energy, making sure that their fleet is electric vehicle, and putting out those commitments and saying, setting a timetable. I think deadlines are incredibly important to drive change, but saying by this time, as a business, we want to achieve this, and hopefully we'll get there even quicker, is another fundamental way of really illustrating that that is where we need to go and can get there whilst delivering prosperity as well. That's what we need, is still prosperous communities and countries to make sure that we thrive as a society.
What do you think is the key skill set, the key qualifications, if you like, that a business student today would need to acquire to have a positive impact, a positive environmental and social impact through the way they do business, through the way they work for government or run organizations?
So this is going to be key to any student's rest of their career. This is something that we're all going to be working on for the rest of our lives. I think collaboration and partnership is absolutely key, and unusual ones. And I think that is where we'll get those solutions. Co-creating the world that we need to live in is about, thinking outside of the box and just being prepared to join up those dots. And I think that is a skill set that you can learn, particularly if you're in business school, but at any stage of your university career, to really make sure that you're looking at all of the different disciplines and understanding them enough, not so that you're an expert, but so that you know who to go to and which other sectors to go to for those solutions. I think it's important in your career to work in both the private, public and third sector, so that you understand the different ways that they're operating and understand how to take the very best of each of those sectors to make sure that we're coming up with good solutions in business.
You mentioned unusual collaborations. Did you have any example of a collaboration that you would call a bit unusual or out of the box thinking in terms of how this is done?
Yeah, I have seen some businesses work on projects with some of their biggest critics from the environmental movement. Now, some NGOs will not be prepared to do that, but for others, sharing that passion to come up with a solution, if the business is really about reinventing itself, can deliver a very, very strong partnership. But also understanding that you as an organisation don't necessarily have all the skills that you require. I can think of one investment product that our pension fund invests in, which is a collaboration between an NGO, a fund manager and a property developer. Those sorts of skill mixes will provide the solutions and the performance that we need in the future.
It's interesting that you mentioned the NGO space, because now we see a number of even activist organizations literally buying shares in companies so as to at least have a seat at the table at shareholder meetings.
Absolutely. There's a lot going on, and I think we all as leaders need to be thinking about what can I do today to make a difference. And too often I think individuals are not making the most of their role as an investor, even if it's at a personal level, to ask some of the questions that need to be heard by boards of companies.
It's interesting, right? Because that information almost doesn't cascade. I don't know how many people, general public perhaps, including myself, would know and tell you precisely how my pension fund is being invested, to what extent is it ESG, what are the scores of the funds that I invest in. I wanted your views on one more thing. There is a debate out there on this whole idea of whether shareholder activism in the sense of engagement as opposed to divestment may potentially be more impactful in terms of actually changing corporate behavior towards ESG issues. Some would say that divestment is basically abandoning the fight. Some would say that actually divestment may delegitimize some of these industries. So in the long run, it might be a good thing, and vice versa for engagement. Do you have any views perhaps on divestment versus engagement?
So I think the whole divestment movement has been extraordinary for putting climate change on the agenda. And I think what it's meant that if you as an investor have chosen to engage on this issue, it's up to what you need to do and be able to demonstrate to your beneficiaries that you really are engaging on the climate change agenda. So the Environment Agency Pension Fund, alongside other investors, including the Church's national investment bodies, set up something called the Transition Pathway Initiative. We knew that if we were going to persuade our beneficiaries that we are making the right choice by continuing to hold high carbon companies, albeit in many instances underweight, we had to demonstrate that when we said we were engaging, we really were engaging. And the Transition Pathway Initiative is one tool. It's now supported by something like $12 trillion of assets under management. Very quickly, over a period of about 2.5 years, it's grown from a couple of small institutions to a much more global initiative. But I think you still need to understand at what point you will say, I can no longer hold this company within my portfolio because it is at risk, because it is not moving, transitioning in time to meet with the Paris agreements. And I think that is something that you have to mean it if you are going to engage, and decide at which point you say, we're not making a difference. We need to make an investment choice on behalf of our beneficiaries.
So not only a binary choice, but there are these more dynamic and progress concerns that one should take into account before making that decision of where do you stop the engagement, because perhaps it's not as effective as it could have been.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that this needs to remain a very live discussion. And to your point of individuals not understanding where their pension fund is invested, I think we've clouded the language of investment in terms that render it really impossible to understand what you're invested in. We say you're invested in a global equity fund, as opposed to you're invested in global companies, and this is what we're doing. So again, I think they're in encouraging individuals to understand more about their investments, we need to simplify some of the language.
I think this speaks to the broader issue of these artificial silos, right? So understanding the role of each individual person, not only as a consumer, but as an investor and as an employee, as a member of a community or a broader community, is also quite important.
Absolutely, but I think I come back to every time you can get overwhelmed by the complexity of a situation and why we're not seeing progress, to thinking about, what can I do in my current roles to make a difference, and then start concentrating on that. And as all taking responsibility for the roles that we play and our involvement in either delivering change or not.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Emma, for this very insightful discussion.
Thank you very much.